Hello, this is another video for American Literature 2. I'm going to keep this really brief because you've got a lot of work to do this week. I know I'm asking you to read three different sections from this. I think this is the last week we're actually using this anthology before we move on to the next volume. And you're also working on putting all the parts of your paper together for a rough draft to be turned in at the end of the week. So you got a lot to do. And also, hopefully, we'll actually be able to discuss these readings for this week next week when we meet as a group in class, or at least most of us meet. So I'll let you know more about those plans. I'll send out an email to y'all later in the week about that. But hopefully we'll actually be having in-person meetings. So we can talk about these readings in a little bit more detail when we get together, or most of us get together as a group next week. But I do want to just kind of preview a little bit these readings because it's really important. We're moving out of the 19th century into the 20th century. All three of these readings are written in that decade, the turn of the century, into the 20th century. And they're all by African American writers, and they represent kind of both a literary development, but also a political development. And I just wanted to kind of put that context out there, maybe before you read these authors for the first time. Because especially with two of them, especially with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, they're representing a kind of tension, a kind of debate that goes on through the 20th century into the 21st century. We're still kind of figuring out the dynamics that they were arguing about at the beginning of the 20th century. About Du Bois, I spent part of my childhood in Louisiana, so I always called him W.E.B. Du Bois, because I went to school with a bunch of Du Bois, right? The French pronunciation. But every scholar I've ever heard talk about this particular person, either in history or sociology or literature, they always say Du Bois, so that's what I'm going to go with. But, I've heard it both ways. Anyway, so Booker T. Washington, who's both important kind of as a literary figure, but maybe even more so as a political figure. And in fact, at one time, he was considered kind of the leader, the spokesperson of the African American community in the late 19th century and on into the 20th century, particularly because his model of education, he started the Tuskegee Institute, which now is the Tuskegee University. He started that at a time when that was a dangerous thing to do, like literally dangerous, to go to Alabama to educate African Americans at a time after the Civil War and after Reconstruction didn't kind of repair things the way the federal government was hoping for, and at a time when kind of systematic racism, kind of Jim Crow South was being set up, and here's Booker T. Washington saying, give me some space, some political space to establish this model of white and black communities living together. Let me have that space. And so we have to read his work in that context, that he has a very political position he's trying to defend and explain. But some of the things in his writing, I still question. I still can't quite figure out why he's saying the things he's saying. I want to give you one example, and then I'll move on. I'm asking you to read from his 2 chapters from his book, Up from Slavery. So just chapter 1 and chapter 14. There's a chapter in between that I'm not asking you to read. I'm asking you to read the first chapter because he picks up the tradition of the slave narrative. He was born into enslavement. And this first chapter represents the tradition of the slave narrative, talking about his experience. But in that chapter, he writes this. and he's writing this book as a much later in his life, even though this first chapter is about his childhood. This is one of several autobiographies or memoirs that he wrote. But he writes this passage, and this was published in like 1900, 1901, at the time where he's trying to kind of protect and fund the Tuskegee Institute with his writing. But also a time when, Jim Crow's being set up, when racial violence is prevalent throughout the South and throughout the country. He writes this. This is top of page 707 in our book. When we rid ourselves of prejudice, of racial feeling, and look the facts in the face, we must acknowledge that notwithstanding the cruelty and moral wrong of slavery, the 10 million Negroes inhabiting this country, who themselves or whose ancestors went through the school of American slavery, are in a stronger and more hopeful condition, materially, intellectually, morally, and religiously, than is true of an equal number of black people in any other portion of the globe. How does a man who was born as an enslaved person and who struggled throughout his life to live, for one thing, and then to accomplish the many great things he accomplished, why would he include almost an apology for slavery? Yeah, it was wrong, but we're better off for it than any other group of black people in the world. Why would he be writing that in 1900? That's a question that I will ask you again when I see you face to face, because I can't believe the sincerity of that. Like, oh, it was actually worked out great after he was just writing about what his childhood was like as an enslaved person. Didn't sound so great when he was writing about his own life, but he's saying that all in all, the results were better off. My BS detector kind of goes off, except I think there are particular reasons he might have written that at the time he wrote it. The other thing that comes up a lot, in fact, writing that set off Du Bois's BS detector, was the writing about the Atlanta Compromise, and that's what chapter 14 is about. And it's a famous speech he gave, basically saying there's a compromise that can be made where African Americans will give up some demands from the power structure, the white governments in the South. If you let us have some space, economically and educationally, we can give up, we can put off, we can defer our dreams for kind of political and civil rights. And so it's famous for that. It's called the Atlanta Compromise, wildly popular among both black and white audiences at the time, and made him famous, made him the black leader of his time, largely because of this speech that he gave. And it's famous for a couple of things. There's the phrase, cast down your buckets where you are. And that's kind of the metaphor at the beginning of the speech that you'll read. And that's basically a call for African Americans to stay put in the rural South and make their lives there, as opposed to the Great Migration, as opposed to going out of the rural South and up to the urban North. For a chance at better opportunities and a better chance at equal treatment. So there's that famous phrase. The other phrase is about the hand, the fingers and the fist. And this is on the top of page 718 in our book. And this is again kind of talking about the compromise. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers of a hand. And one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. If it's economics, we can work together. But anything social, like our kids going to school together or voting rights or anything else, we can stay separate. We can have two systems, one for whites, one for blacks. But anything that is good for us together economically, we can work together. That's the kind of essential of the compromise. And it had a lot of support at the time, and continued to have some support. And you can argue for what his goals were at the time he's writing, there's pretty good reasons for him to make this compromise. However, W.E.B. Du Bois wasn't signing up for that, right? And in fact, in The Souls of Black Folk, and again, I'm asking you not to read the whole book, but just a couple chapters, the first chapter and then the chapter where he's directly criticizing the Atlanta Compromise, he talks about that. Du Bois was having none of it, right? And so it's this kind of gradualist approach versus what we now call the civil rights approach, right? That Du Bois is arguing for. And the first chapter of his book is very famous. Also has some beautiful passages. Probably the most important thing is on page 922 of our book, where he talks about the double consciousness, which still is written about, still kind of echoes in writing about race. Here's what the basics of it, although he goes on to talk about it. One, an African American always feels this two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn apart. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. That idea that how do you be both an American and black at the same time, when history, when politics, when stories all say that those two things cannot be peacefully merged together into one soul. Du Bois is trying to figure out how to have that be a possibility, right? That's what the first chapter is about. And it's rightfully famous. I mean, it's from the early 1900s on into the 21st century, people have been picking that language up and those questions up, because frankly, we're still in a slightly different form asking those very same questions. The other chapter, he's basically directly criticizing the Atlanta Compromise, and saying where these are the rights we cannot give up on, we cannot defer to a later date. So it's a fascinating, that conflict comes up again, right, in the 50s and the 1960s, where some people say that Martin Luther King's nonviolent movement is kind of too gradual, where Malcolm X's more strident demands are at odds against those, right? So we see again a kind of echo of this confrontation, this debate about what's the best way forward. And in some ways, again, in the 21st century, we're still dealing with that. What demands have to be addressed right now? What problems are going to have to be changed more gradually because they're more systematic and can't be finger snapped into fixing. So that debate is ongoing, right? And the third person is Ida B. Wells, who's writing about another, it's called Mob Rule in New Orleans, and it's about another incitement to violence in the city, which happened in many cities, and not just in the South, but not just in Wilmington, North Carolina, or New Orleans, Louisiana, but all over. But this is a pretty famous case, and she had kind of two central projects, and she's a really, really important figure, because at the time there weren't a lot of female journalists, and there certainly weren't very many black female journalists, and so she was cutting edge just for doing what she was doing, reporting on what's going on in the South. But she's also really important because she was at the forefront of this kind of anti-lynching movement, calling attention to it, when the fact that there was lynching going on all over the country, particularly in the rural South, and it just was invisible. It's as if it didn't happen because there was no media reporting of it. So she worked most of her life working on that. And she also we would call her today a media critic, right? She was looking at how media is covering events and criticizing that and helping to foster African American journalism, setting up black newspapers, some of which are still in existence, still publishing. So she's really important on a couple fronts. And the events she's talking about will sound sadly too familiar. But anyway, so we have these three really important voices writing at the beginning of the 20th century that are worth our attention because, again, the issues they're writing about, we are still struggling with today. Anyway, you've got a lot to do. I've got a lot of grading to do. I got 111 papers in today, so we're all busy. But, man, I'm hoping to see you all face-to-face soon. I can also, if you have questions that you would like to discuss this week, I can still meet y'all on Teams for one-on-one conversations, particularly if you have questions about the paper that you're working on, the rough draft. That would be great. So just shoot me an email or text me in Teams. We could set up a meeting time. That's all I've got. Work hard. Be kind. I'll see you soon, hopefully in person. Bye-bye.